Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have the first Nova Scotia provincial election forecast. Now, there's not going to be one anytime soon, probably, but I'll get into that in a little bit. But before we begin, I would just like to shout out my channel members once again. They greatly support the channel, and I really appreciate all of your guys' support. If you want to support me and all the work I do here, go down to the channel link below and join. Otherwise, if you can't afford to do that, I understand. And just do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, and comment below. Well, no further ado, let us begin. So just to start with, there's not likely going to be an election this year. I would really expect it's going to be spring, summer, fall 2025. It could also be August again, but I feel like everyone involved in politics would rather it be in September than August, because summer elections are usually not preferred. People go on vacations and go on trips and stuff like that, and it's not desirable. People don't want the actual political establishment doesn't like them in the summer. They do happen, obviously, but people try to avoid it. But there has been some rumors. I've actually heard them from pretty relevant people that Houston is thinking about doing faster elections. I've heard people saying that he wants to do a 3-year election cycle, in which case there'd be an election this year. I'm really skeptical of that. I don't think that's going to be the case. But I have heard that. So if it does happen, I guess it's not entirely unexpected, but I really don't think that's going to happen. That said, who knows? Maybe it will. Now, that brings us to the interesting main question of this video. Why is Houston so dominant here? Now, in 2021, he won a comfortable, but actually relatively narrow victory. He only won by about 1.8% of the popular vote, but he did win by 14 seats. All flips, interestingly enough. Well, actually, technically he had 15 flips and he lost 1 seat, but anyways. So that's actually quite interesting. It was a pretty narrow win there, but now we're looking at a very wide win. We're looking at 45% to 24 and to 26, a 19-point margin. 21 over the Liberals, who came in second place last election. He's looking at 42 seats, nearly all of the seats in the entire province. Just 13 others remain. And of those, they're basically all just the most urban seats. Only Timberley Prospect and Halifax Atlantic have any semblance of not being an urban seat to them. And technically Halifax Atlantic is relatively urban, despite it being a relatively large riding size. A lot of this part of the riding is pretty sparse. A lot of the people live in this area here. But anyways. So why is it like this, right? Why is Houston so dominant? Is it a similar story that we're seeing federally, but kind of inverse with quality of being in government? This scenario being quality of government? No, not quite, but it does affect this, right? So there's a couple factors of this. So we're going to start off with extrinsic factors, things that Houston himself isn't doing. Things that he has just bequeathed, giving him such a strong position. And I would argue, and the reason I'm doing this first, I think these are the more important factors to it. The more relevant to understand how and why he's winning so much. So the first is The federal Liberals are extremely unpopular. They're also dropping rapidly in popularity in Nova Scotia, and especially rural Nova Scotia is rapidly aligning against the federal Liberals. It's not yet seen if this is going to just be a case of toss them out and then eventually they'll come back, such as 1984, or this could just be a permanent switch, which does occasionally happen. The last instance of this federally or nationally would have been Saskatchewan, which used to be NDP conservative swing, and now it's basically just conservative dominance. We might be seeing the first inklings of that here in Nova Scotia. We might not. And in Nova Scotia case, the Liberals would be losing out the NDP. We don't have enough data yet. We would need more elections to really determine that, but that is a possibility. But the consequence of this, since the Liberals are taking an objective beating federally, the provincial Liberals, which are tied to the hip to the federal Liberals, they are associated parties, quite literally. Unlike the PCs, who are autonomous, they are unrelated to the federal Conservative Party. There's a lot of sharing of personnel between the two parties, but there's no inherent sharing of personnel. There's no necessity to share personnel. Houston is not obligated to defend Poilievre. He has no reason to defend Poilievre unless he wants to, unless he agrees with him. Churchill, intrinsically, because the parties are the same, has to defend Trudeau. And that's a big issue for them. That makes it very difficult for them. And notably, one of the really big ones that is Houston has done quite a good job capitalizing on for this, is the carbon tax, which especially and very importantly is a very good wedge issue in Nova Scotia between urban and rural. Not to say Haligonians or Sydney, New Waterford, Glace Bay like the carbon tax, which they don't usually by polling, but the rural areas really don't like it. And it's pretty obvious why that would be. You look at, I don't know, lobster fishermen in the South Shore, or people working in mines in like the Cumberland area, or other such industries in the rural parts of the province, right? They drive a lot more. First off, that's a big one. The rural parts of the province usually have less access to public transportation. Obviously. They are usually poorer areas, unfortunately, and are more likely to use oil heating. Though now that that's been exempt, that's less of a big issue. But you see these things. So there's a bunch of things where the carbon tax explicitly hits a lot of the rural communities more than it hits the urban communities, because there's no options for them to change their lifestyle. For them, it's no longer a case of carrot with stick. It's just a stick. Because the idea behind the carbon tax, at least in theory, is that someone can change their behaviors to pay less carbon tax. If you have no way to change your behaviors, then you're just getting hit with a stick. And the Liberals in the province can't do anything about this. They have to defend it because that's the party line. Now, they could break ties with the federal party, but there seems to be no willpower or desire to do that just yet. So they're not. There's already one big issue. The next big issue, and this one I think is possibly even more impactful, is the Liberals almost rushed to select a new leader. So Ian Rankin resigned as leader of the NSLP in January 2022. And by July 9th, 2022, they had selected a new leader. Now, 6 months doesn't seem like that long of a time. The time frame doesn't seem that crazy. I mean, O'Toole was couped in January 2022. 2022, and actually that September, Poilievre was elected. But going from February to September it's about another month. So not a big difference, right? The relevant difference and the important difference is the publicity this got. The conservative leadership race got a lot of publicity, and after getting elected as the conservative leader, Poilievre has made sure to stay in the news cycle continuously. A lot of liberal partisans are actually really mad that he is quote-unquote campaigning outside of the writ period, and they're trying to get Elections Canada mad at him, but he's not doing anything illegal or wrong. He's just doing his job as the party leader. And this is keeping Poilievre really present in the news, present in people's minds. People are seeing what he's talking about, what he cares about, what he wants to do. Zach Churchill is doing literally the exact opposite strategy. Churchill is invisible. Prior to doing some research for this video, I couldn't tell you a single thing Churchill himself wants to do. A single thing that the NSLP cares about. There's some niche, like tiny little things that pop up here and there, but no one cares about those things. There's no general vision for the province. There's no alternative plans to Houston. So in a sense, despite the province being gripped with many serious crises, housing, the economy, fertility, doctors, healthcare in general, many very big crises hitting the province, the NSLP has no ideas, at least no ideas that they are pushing to the public, no ideas that are disseminating to the average person. Your Joe Blow voter in Halifax, or your Joe Blow voter in Annapolis, or your Joe Blow voter in Richmond has no concept of what Churchill wants to do, what he cares about, what he stands for. He's invisible. Maybe people in his own riding, in Yarmouth area, might have some idea, but that's skeptical too. That's why he's losing his own riding, probably. So he's just completely invisible. Now, the conclusion, or the natural theoretical position is if the NSLP is deciding to just be invisible, the natural conclusion is, okay, well, maybe the New Democrats under Claudia Chender will try to take their place and be visible and do things and talk about things. But the NDP is doing the same thing the NDP loves doing across the country, at least east of Manitoba and nationally. And it's seemingly, from what everything I can see, and I'm summarizing a lot, and I'm glossing over some details for brevity, but for the most part, her campaign is best way described as she's campaigning to be the mayor of Halifax, but she's running for the premier. And this is a systemic issue that the NDP nationally runs into. Singh's doing the same thing. He's running to be the premier or the prime minister of Canada, but he's effectively wanting to do things that's provincial jurisdiction. That's all the things he cares about. Dental plan, Primacare, blah, 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 all that stuff, right? That's all provincial. He only cares about provincial issues. He has no input or care about federal issues. That's not his main concerns. It's not things he's talking about. And the provincial NDP has the exact same problem. They're primarily talking about Halifax-specific concerns. And this is not to say that those concerns aren't real concerns. One of the big ones the NDP is talking about a lot is rents being really high, homelessness, and stuff like that. And I have nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong or bad about the NDP talking about that, bringing it up, being concerned about it. But when that's the main thing that's being conveyed to the voters, and that's not really a problem in the rest of the province to the same degree, like housing is a problem everywhere, sure. Homelessness isn't really a problem everywhere because, generally speaking, the homeless population from the rest of the province eventually makes their way to Halifax anyways. It's just not viable to survive in Windsor if you're homeless. There's just not enough support. There's not enough options. So they usually make their way there. Sure, there's absolutely some in different parts of the province. I'm not saying there's zero, but it tends to collect in Halifax. That's where the most support is. And a lot of these things, like one of the big issues that Gary Burrell campaigned on in 2021 was rent control. Wanting to take the pandemic rent control measures and make them permanent. Which doesn't really grip very well because, for the most part, it's really only Halifax, and to a lesser extent Sydney, New Waterford, Glace Bay, that have any meaningful quantity of renters. Yes, there's some in Truro. Yes, there's some in Pictou, New Glasgow, Stellarton area. Yes, there's some in like King's Hands, or not King's Hands. Well, I mean, yes, King's Hands, but I mean specifically like Wolfville area. Yeah, there's renters who exist there. I'm not saying there's none, but the proportion of homeowners to renters is like a lot. And the best way to phrase this, there's more renters relative to homeowners in Halifax than the rest of the province. And the rest of the province is, I believe, something like 80% homeowners to 20% renting or something like that. In some areas, close to 100% own their own homes, or at least in theory own their own homes. So campaigning on one of your main issues being rent control just falls flat to the rest of the province. They might not necessarily oppose rent control, though they might, but they also don't really care. It doesn't affect them. You're not motivating them. There's no reason to vote for you. You're not doing anything for them. And that's an issue the NDP's really been having time and again since Darrell Dexter retired. Now, Darrell Dexter was kind of a surprise win for the NDP in a sense, in that they got into power and then they did not know how to use it properly. The best way to describe this is, so my family tends to be, I have several family members who are NDP leaning, and they're smart people. They know a lot of stuff, and they don't like the NDP now. I have friends and family, or like, for example, my father-in-law, or future father-in-law, I should say. Historically NDP leaning, doesn't vote NDP anymore since 2013, especially after Singh, 2018 when Singh was nominated, or 2019 when Singh was nominated, because those parties no longer speak to his concerns, or in the provincial case, were just incompetent in government. And that's just their systemic problem. They've not really done anything to fix that. Since then, they've only campaigned on basically Halifax-specific issues, which has effectively given the NDP like a ceiling of 10 seats, maybe a few more. Like on this map, the only other seats they're vaguely competitive in is Clayton Park and then the two Bedfords. And they're not that competitive in either Bedford. Historically, they were competitive in Sackville's or Pictou area, because there used to be a lot of working class vote there who went NDP. Not anymore, because they don't represent them anymore. And as part of this, I think, generalized global realignment we're seeing take place natively in Nova Scotia. A lot of these very working class areas no longer vote NDP anymore, because the NDP doesn't care about them. Oh, you're rural? I don't care. Oh, you drive a pickup truck? I don't care. It's kind of what the NDP is telling these people. And is it any surprise that these people don't vote for them anymore? So then it brings us to Houston himself. What is Houston doing? Why is Houston so successful? And, well, to be honest, now this is not necessarily to say Houston himself is doing anything wrong. At the same token, there's nothing to say that he's actually succeeding at anything. The main issues in his premiership that pre-existed him, to his credit, housing and healthcare, are only getting worse. Now, I would argue, in a general polemic term, that the premier of a province has, in effect, zero control over either of those crises right now because they're driven by the federal government. But that being said, Houston himself is also supporting, in that specific regard, the federal government throwing gasoline on these fires, and that his plan is to increase he wants, I believe by 2060, wants Nova Scotia at 2 million people, 2 million residents. That's literally the entire reason why we have a housing and a doctor crisis. The population growth is outstripping our ability to train doctors, retain doctors, and to build houses. So increasing the population rapidly, and keep in mind, the last 20 years prior to this, Nova Scotia's population hasn't increased. So going from 20, 30 years of negative to zero growth to 30 to 40 years of significant growth, that's a big deal. That's not going to work out very well. It's not going to make any of the problems better. So that's kind of the situation we're in Nova Scotia. But that's also why Houston is actually dominating right now. The opposition isn't even trying. They're irrelevant. They don't mean anything. If you remember back to my Quebec videos, and how I initially, back in 2022, was very skeptical about the Parti Québécois' future because I was making, I think, a categorical mistake there, which I've admitted to before, but I'm admitting to yet again, in that I was misreading voter-based supports. And I think since then I've learned my lesson on that. So in Quebec, one of the reasons why the Parti Québécois went from nothing in 2022, they got like 3 seats barely, to now they're polling in first place and they could possibly win majority government in just 2 years, is in Quebec, while there's 6 political parties, there's only 2 that matter. I know, bold claim, right? There's only 2 that matter in Quebec. You might think, oh, is it the Liberal Party? Nope. The Conservatives? Nope. Quebec Solidaire? Nope. Actually, there's only 5 parties in Quebec. I don't know where the 6th one came from in my mind. Anyways, it's just the Parti Québécois and the CAQ. And those are the only 2 that matter because they're the only 2 parties that are competitive in the outskirts of Montreal, rural Quebec, and Quebec City. There's only like 2 parties that are actually competitive in Montreal itself, which is Quebec Solidaire and the Liberals. But that's only about 20 seats of 120. So the other 100 seats, more or less, only have 2 parties that, in theory, could win all of them. Obviously, they will never win all 100, or probably, sorry for this. Obviously, it's very difficult for either Quebec Solid or Quebec Party, the Parti Québécois or the CAQ to win all 100 seats in the rest of Quebec. But they're the only 2 who, in principle, in theory, could win those seats. All of them. In the right scheme of things, the right swing of the dice. And that's where we are in Nova Scotia. The best way to look at this election right now, or this future election, isn't that there is 3 parties competing to be Premier of Nova Scotia, to form government. It's really 2 parties competing, and one party has just had a string of bad luck, like the Parti Québécois did in 2018, 2014, and 2022. We're now looking at 2021, 2025 as a string of bad luck for the Liberals. But they're the only other party right now that actually has, in principle, the capacity to win. Sure, they're polling in 3rd place, they have seats in 3rd place, but they're actually the main opposition to Houston. Despite, if this election happened, they would not formally be the official opposition. They are de facto the official opposition, because the NDP physically cannot win. Not in its current iteration. In any iteration where the NDP could win, it would look more like the Liberal Party than it would look like the NDP. And why can't it win? Well, just a quick refresher on how provincial politics in Nova Scotia works for anyone who's never noticed. The NSLP is socially liberal, fiscally conservative. The PCs are fiscally liberal and socially moderate. And the NDP is socially liberal and fiscally liberal. That's a strange setup, but that's what it is. So the Liberals can compete in rural areas on fiscal issues with the PCs. And the PCs can compete with the NDP on fiscal issues in working class areas and actually just destroys them because most working class areas are socially conservative and the NDP isn't socially conservative in the slightest. Can't even pretend to be. Can't even attempt to claim that title. So the PCs just annihilate the NDP in working class areas these days. And then the Liberals usually beat the NDP in suburbs because the Liberals are as socially liberal as the NDP in the suburbs, but they're more fiscally conservative. Suburbs usually like fiscal conservatism. Who wins the rural area really kind of comes down to, are people more concerned about services right now, balanced budgets right now, or social issues right now? And right now they want spending. They want things like healthcare. And the PCs in their current iteration are the only party who can appeal to rural voters and actually wants to spend money. That's the situation we're in. In the long term, eventually, after Churchill's kicked out and some other person comes into power and stops being invisible, the NSLP will probably rebound because, again, the NDP physically can't win. It might look like to an outsider that the NDP is to the left of the other two parties, but it's actually the NDP that's squeezed by the other two parties. The NDP is being pushed on working class areas, on fiscal issues by the PCs, and is being pushed in wealthy, more libertarian-leaning rural areas and suburbs on social issues from the Liberals. So the NDP can't win. The only time the NDP can win is something like a Darrell Dexter, where they just utterly defeat both other parties simultaneously. And yeah, that occasionally will happen. I mean, it did once. But we're not talking about that happening frequently. It can't happen very frequently. It manifestly can't happen very frequently. Because that's how the party works. That's how the political spectrum here is. Just as show of what I mean, here is the 2009 map. Notice here what we're seeing. Wealthy suburbs. Well, this part's not wealthy, but suburby areas, suburby areas, suburby areas, suburby areas. Liberals. Kind of like your libertarianish leaning areas. That's a really gross oversimplification, but bear with me. Liberals. More working class areas. PCs. The other parts, NDP. And again, this just shows you here. Pictou East was like 65% NDP in this election, and now it's like 70% PC. Like this is how destroyed the NDP is in this province in a lot of these areas. Like, it manifestly can't win. So eventually, what's going to happen is either the budget's going to get really, really bad, and then the people will be concerned about the budget, and then they'll vote the Liberals in, or the Liberals will get a new leader who's, like, not invisible, and that will happen, or Houston will screw up, or something like that, and eventually the Liberals will rebound, and then they'll probably be they'll once again be the main opposition to Houston. 2010, 2020 wasn't an anomaly. This is the map of 2021. This is an easier way to show it too. Look at this. Suburby areas, Liberals. Annapolis Valley area, Liberals. Everything else, Conservative. Very deep urban areas, NDP. That's how it's going to be. That's how these elections are going to happen. And then occasionally what you're going to see is you're going to see places like the Lunenburgs, Chester St. Margaret's, the other Kings, the Hanses. The Liberals will win those. Eventually, one day, when they form the next government, they might win some of the ridings around here, like maybe Eastern Passage or something, or in Dartmouth North. And they'll do that because the NDP can't win those ridings. And eventually, either those Houston will screw up, or people get tired of him, or something will happen where the PCs aren't fast on their feet and they just kind of sit on it. And then eventually the Liberals will win again. That's how this always works, right? No party governs forever. And that's the only path this can be. There's no other way this goes. It will always go this way. At least, as long as Nova Scotia has its current demographic position. And I don't mean age. I don't mean some, like income or education or race or anything. No, I literally mean rural versus urban. Urbanization rate. If we end up getting 2 million people from Houston's plan, that might change things a lot. But as long as we're around the current population we are with the current distribution we have, that's how this province will function politically. It won't function any other way. Because 60% of the province is not Halifax by population. Actually, we can see this quite well. I'll just unhide this for a moment. So this is the registered voters by area. Halifax is 344,000. The entire province has about 800,000. In fact, we could even do some quick spreadsheet math on the fly. Look at that. About 43% is Halifax. But that 43% that is Halifax includes places like Timberlea Prospect, the Eastern Shore. Even arguably some places in like Waverly Fall River or the Sackville Uniacke and stuff like that. Preston, in some instances, are only like dubiously urban and probably shouldn't be considered urban. They're just part of Halifax County, so they're part of Halifax in this regard. But in any meaningful sense of the term, are they urban? No. And that's the situation, right? The NDP can only really win with the perfect run of the cards. There's a reason why it's only happened once. The PCs will normally win by default, which they've won by, I think, about 65% of the time on average. Because they have a better check on either other opposition party, and the Liberals eventually will win again. Eventually, one day. That might change eventually. I mean, there's a lot of other areas that are going through what I've dubbed in previous series, quote unquote, the Democratic Revolution cycle, but I do not see that happening in Nova Scotia in a way that's going to shake up this cycle. Though most we might see is we could possibly be seeing filtering closer to the rest of the country, in that the PCs might become a little more socially conservative and the Liberals might become a little less fiscally liberal or fiscally conservative. That might happen. Though if that were to happen, I expect the Liberals and the NDP to almost never win elections again. So that might not happen, to be honest. If every party is fiscally moderate or fiscally liberal, the PCs will win every single election, more or less. Like, it won't even be close. What is the appeal to rural areas if you're not going to offer them fiscal prudence? You're not going to win them with social liberalism. Not in the slightest. But that is the situation as is in Nova Scotia right now. Don't expect an update anytime soon. There's not a lot of polls in Nova Scotia, and I don't think an election's going to happen anytime soon, and not much happens here because the opposition is invisible. So there's not much to report. But that is your summary of the last 3 years of Nova Scotian politics. So with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week.